That morning, I drove out to visit my wife's grave, the way I did every single Sunday. There was a chain-link fence where the gate used to be. My son answered the phone and said, "Dad, it's just business. You'll thank me later." I said absolutely nothing. I turned the car around, drove home and made one phone call. 6 months later, my son and his wife stood on a lawn that used to be their own front yard. Watching strangers pour concrete for a tomb, neither of them were ever invited to visit. If you're watching this, tell me where you're listening from, and let me tell you exactly how this nightmare began. It was a grey Tuesday morning in November, the kind of morning where the fog sits low over the hills outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and doesn't burn off until almost 10. I'm Walter Kensington. I'm 73 years old. I spent 31 years on the federal bench before I retired, and before that, another decade as a litigator, who never lost a case he truly believed in. I tell you this not to boast, but because it matters to everything that follows. When you spend your whole life inside the machinery of the law, you learn something most people never do. You learn exactly how thin the walls are between a family and a courtroom, and you learn exactly how much rope a desperate person will hand you if you simply wait. That Tuesday morning I woke up at 5:30, same as always. I made coffee in the percolator Eleanor bought us in 1994. The one Nathan always said I should replace with one of those pod machines. I told him some things aren't meant to be convenient. Some things are meant to last. I drove the 11 miles out to Larkspur Hill Cemetery, the private burial ground that had belonged to my family since my great-grandfather purchased the land in 1911. 4 generations of Kensingtons were resting on that hillside under the old oak trees. My parents, my grandparents, and for the last 3 years, my wife Eleanor. I want to tell you about Eleanor, because you need to understand what was actually stolen from me that day, and it was never really about land. Eleanor Kensington was the daughter of a coal miner from West Virginia who put herself through nursing school on scholarships and sheer stubbornness. She worked 38 years in the pediatric ward at Mission Hospital. She held the hands of more dying children than any human being should ever have to, and she came home every single night and made dinner and asked me about my day like my day mattered more than hers. We were married for 44 years. When the cancer finally took her, she made me promise her exactly one thing in that hospice bed. Her hand so thin I was afraid to hold it too tight. She said, "Walter, I don't want anything fancy. I just want to be laid where I can see the oak trees, and I want you to keep the family together on that hill. That's all I ask. Keep us together." I promised her, and for 3 years, every single Sunday, I drove out to that hill, and I sat beside her headstone, and I told her about the week. I told her when our granddaughter lost her first tooth. I told her when the Braves had a good season. I told her every single time that I missed her more than words could carry. So when I pulled up that Tuesday morning and found a chain-link construction, fence where the old iron gate used to stand, and a laminated notice zip-tied to the post that read, "Notice of pending relocation. Gravesites to be disinterred and transferred," I did not scream. I did not collapse against my steering wheel. 31 years on the bench teaches you that panic is a luxury reserved for people who haven't yet figured out what happened. I got out of the car. I read the notice 3 times, and then I read the name at the bottom of the authorizing seller line, and my stomach turned to ice. Nathan Kensington, my son, my only child. I stood there in the cold November fog with my hand pressed against that chain-link fence, staring at a name I had watched a nurse write on a birth certificate 36 years earlier. Underneath his signature was the name of a company I had never heard of, Havenbrook Development Group, LLC. Beside it, a dollar figure, $340,000. My family's hillside, the resting place of Eleanor Kensington, sold like a used car, for less than the price of a modest condo, to build what the notice described, in the coldest bureaucratic language imaginable, as a 22-unit luxury townhome community with reserved mountain views. They were going to dig up my wife to build a view for strangers. I did not call Nathan that instant, though every animal instinct in my chest wanted to drive straight to his house and demand an explanation with my bare hands. Instead, I did what I trained myself to do for 3 Decades in courtrooms watching guilty men lie to my face with absolute confidence. I documented everything. I photographed the notice from 4 angles. I photographed the fence, the surveyor's stakes already planted in the grass not 10 feet from Eleanor's headstone, the little pink flags, marking where a bulldozer's path would run directly through the resting place of my grandfather. Then I got back in my car and I drove home. And I sat at my kitchen table and I called my son. He picked up on the 4th ring. I could hear a television in the background, some morning talk show, and the clinking of a spoon against a coffee mug, the domestic soundtrack of a man who had absolutely no idea his world was about to end. "Hey, Dad," he said, casual as anything. "What's up?" "I'm standing at Larkspur Hill," I said. My voice was flat. I had learned long ago that flat is far more frightening than loud. "There's a construction fence around your mother's grave, Nathan. There's a notice with your signature on it. Explain this to me." There was a pause. Not the pause of a man confused. The pause of a man calculating how much of the truth he could get away with. "Dad, it's just business," he finally said. "And I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I have replayed it in my mind every single day since. Just business. My wife's grave. My family's hill. Just business. The land is worth a fortune now that the county rezoned it. I got us a great deal. The bodies get relocated to a nicer plot out past Weaverville. Actually a really beautiful spot. And we walk away with real money. You'll thank me later, once you see the numbers." "Whose money, Nathan?" I asked quietly. "What do you mean, whose money?" "It's family money. I'm the executor of the Kensington Family Trust now, remember? You signed that over to me in Chelsea 2 years ago when you had your knee surgery. In case anything happened to you, I have the authority. I want to pause the story here and tell you something important, the way I would have explained it to a jury. 2 years earlier, before a routine knee replacement, I had indeed signed a limited, temporary power of attorney, effective only during my hospital stay and recovery, and expiring automatically 30 days after the surgery date. I had done it out of an abundance of caution, the same caution that had made me a careful judge for 3 decades. Nathan knew that document had an expiration clause. He had watched Martin Reyes, my old law clerk and closest friend, explain it to him line by line at my own kitchen table. He was betting that I had either forgotten or that I was too old and too grieving to check. "That document expired 18 months ago, Nathan," I said. Another pause. Longer this time. And then his voice shifted, the mask of casual confidence dropping away into something colder, something I did not recognize in my own son. "Dad, look. Chelsea and I are drowning. You have no idea what it's like out here. Her mother's medical bills, the mortgage, the twins starting private school next year. We needed a real number, not a favor. That hillside is sitting there doing nothing but holding dead bodies. Mom's gone, Dad. She doesn't need a view of the oak trees. She's gone. And you keeping that land as some kind of shrine isn't going to bring her back. I did what needed to be done. I'm sorry you found out this way, but it's already signed. The deal closes in 11 days. I sat in my kitchen, in the same chair I had sat in every morning for 44 years beside my wife, and I listened to my son tell me that his mother's grave was an inconvenience, standing between him and a townhome. Development's closing date. Good luck explaining that to a judge, son, I said, and I hung up the phone before he could answer, because I did not trust myself to speak another word without my voice breaking, and I was not yet ready to let him hear that. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my study with the desk lamp on, and I began doing the only thing that has ever made sense to me when the ground disappears beneath my feet. I began building a case. By morning, I had already pulled every document I could locate. The original 1911 deed to Larkspur Hill, which my great-grandfather had purchased outright. No mortgage, no encumbrance. The temporary power of attorney I had signed before my knee surgery, with its expiration clause highlighted in yellow, and buried in a fireproof lockbox in my closet that Nathan did not know existed, a document that would end up mattering more than anything else in this entire story. The Kensington Family Heritage Trust, an irrevocable trust I had quietly established with Eleanor 8 years before she died, back when she first got her diagnosis, and we both understood In the private way, spouses understand things they never say aloud, that we needed to protect what mattered. Before either of us lost the ability to think clearly, Eleanor and I had transferred the deed to Larkspur Hill into that trust. Not to me, not to Nathan, to the trust itself, with a locked provision that no sale, transfer or disinterment could occur without unanimous, written consent of all named trustees, one of whom, per the trust's own language, had to be a sitting or retired officer of the court, specifically included because Eleanor had said, half joking and half deadly serious, Walter, if anyone ever tries to sell this hill out from under us, I want a judge standing in the way. Nathan did not know the trust existed. Nathan had sold land he did not legally own, using an expired power of attorney, to a development company that had apparently never bothered to run a full title search deeper than the county's surface-level property records, which still listed my name from decades earlier as the last recorded individual owner before the trust transfer, since Eleanor and I had structured it privately through an out-of-state trust attorney precisely to keep it quiet. My son had committed fraud to sell a hillside he did not own, to a buyer who did not do their homework, using a legal instrument that had expired 18 months prior. I could have simply called Martin, filed an emergency injunction, and had the entire fraudulent transaction thrown out within a week on the strength of the trust documents alone. Any competent judge would have voided the sale in an afternoon, but I want to be honest with you. The way I was never able to be honest in a courtroom, where the law demands you separate justice from vengeance. I did not want the sale voided quietly. I did not want my son to simply lose a business, deal and walk away with a stern lecture, and a legal bill. He had told me his mother's grave was just business. I decided his life was about to become the same. I called Martin Reyes the next morning. Martin had clerked for me for 6 years before going into private practice, and he had sat at my table more Thanksgivings than his own family's. Back when Nathan was still a boy who wanted nothing more than to be exactly like his father. Martin had watched Nathan grow up. He had watched Eleanor teach Nathan to ride a bicycle in the very driveway. I would later be told to vacate. Walter, Martin said when I finished laying out everything I had found, you understand what you're describing, right? This isn't a family dispute anymore. Forging authority under an expired power of attorney to sell trust property is fraud. Real fraud. Prison time fraud, depending on how the DA wants to charge it. I understand exactly what I'm describing, Martin, I said. He's your son. He told me his mother is gone and doesn't need a view of the trees, I said. And I let that sentence sit in the silence on the line for a long moment. I raised that boy to have a conscience. He traded it in for a townhome deal. I am not going to protect him from the consequence of a decision he made with his eyes wide open. Martin was quiet for a long time. Then he said the same 3 words he had said to me 100 times across a courtroom. Back when we both still believed the system, they could catch anyone if you were patient enough. Then let's build it right. That is precisely what we did for the better part of 11 days. I did not immediately tip my hand. I let Nathan believe his phone call had rattled an old grieving man into helpless silence, exactly the way he expected. I let the 11 days on the closing clock keep ticking, because a good investigator, and 31 years on the bench had made me a very good investigator, knows that the fraud you catch on day 1 is never the whole fraud. There is always a second layer underneath, and a desperate man in a hurry always leaves that second layer exposed if you simply give him enough rope and enough time. The second layer, in this case, were a name I had heard exactly twice before, Derek Holloway. Martin ran the ownership records on Havenbrook Development Group, LLC, the company that had supposedly purchased Larkspur Hill for $340,000. It had been incorporated in Delaware 4 weeks earlier. No prior projects. No permits filed anywhere in Buncombe County. No listed office beyond a mailbox rental service in downtown Asheville. The registered agent was shielded behind an anonymity service, but Martin, who had spent a decade prosecuting shell company fraud before going private, knew exactly where those shields tend to crack. Every LLC filing requires a payment method for the state filing fee, and criminals, however clever, almost never think to hide that. The credit card on file belonged to a 31-year-old man named Derek Holloway. And when I searched that name, my stomach dropped a second time in 11 days. Derek Holloway ran a boutique personal training studio downtown, the kind with exposed brick walls and eucalyptus-scented towels, and his public social media account was an absolute shrine to his own physique. Shirtless gym photos, rented sports cars, and scattered generously through his photo grid, dozens of images of my daughter-in-law, Chelsea, laughing on a weight bench with his hand resting far too comfortably on the small of her back, captioned with hearts and inside jokes that had nothing to do with fitness. Nathan was not simply a man who had betrayed his father for money. Nathan was a man being used by his own wife and her lover to strip his family bare, likely without ever fully understanding whose pockets that $340,000 was actually going to land in once the dust settled. I sat with that discovery for a full day before I told Martin what we were going to do about it, because I needed to be certain that what I was feeling was still justice, and not simply rage wearing justice's clothes. I decided it was both, and I decided both were allowed. Eleanor had installed, at my insistence, a discreet security system inside our old family home years earlier, back when her illness made me anxious about her being alone in the house while I ran errands. Nathan knew about the cameras. He had complained about them constantly whenever he visited, calling them an invasion of privacy, unaware that the physical units he occasionally unplugged during visits were merely the visible relay points. The actual recording hub was hardwired into the attic with an independent battery backup, uploading continuously to an encrypted cloud server that had nothing to do with the visible cameras at all. Nathan believed that pulling a plug from a wall outlet made him invisible. He was wrong, and he had been wrong every single time he had walked through that house. I pulled the archive. 4 nights before the closing date, at nearly 11 at night, Chelsea and Derek had let themselves into my house using a spare key. Nathan didn't know his wife still possessed, and they had sat together in my living room. In the chairs Eleanor had chosen herself from a Charleston furniture shop on our honeymoon, drinking a bottle of scotch I had been saving, and they had talked. I am not going to reproduce every word of that recording here, because some things are better summarized than repeated verbatim, and because I have promised myself I would never let this story become an exact transcript of their cruelty. But I will tell you the shape of what they said, because the shape of it is what mattered. Derek told Chelsea that once the $340,000 cleared, they would funnel it through a second shell account he controlled, and by the time Nathan realized the sale was falling apart, they would already be somewhere, with a beach and no extradition treaty worth mentioning. Chelsea laughed. The particular cruel laugh of someone who believes she has already won, and said that Nathan was too soft and too dumb to notice anything until it's already gone, and that once they disappeared, his idiot father can deal with whatever's left of him. His idiot father, sitting in my study at midnight, hearing my daughter-in-law refer to me that way while sipping the scotch. I had been saving for a happy occasion. I did not feel rage the way you might expect. I felt something colder and far more useful. I felt certainty. There was, however, one detail neither Derek nor Chelsea understood, and it is the detail upon which this entire story turns, so I want you to hold on to it carefully. To fund the down payment on the flashy new house they had already picked out, the one they planned to disappear from the moment the wire cleared, Nathan and Chelsea had quietly sold their own family home 2 weeks earlier and moved into a rental, believing the sale of Larkspur Hill would be their real fortune, and the house was simply a bridge to get there faster. The house had sold for $610,000, a fair market price, to a buyer whose paperwork moved unusually fast, closing in 9 days instead of the standard 30. That buyer was a small holding company named Ridgeline Family Partners, LLC. I had formed Ridgeline Family Partners 4 days after I stood at that chain-link fence and read my son's signature on a notice that would have disinterred my wife. Martin had helped me structure it quietly, the same way, ironically, that Derek had structured his own shell company, except mine was fully lawful, fully funded from the money Eleanor and I had built over 4 decades of careful living, and fully mine. My son and his wife had sold their own house to me, without ever knowing it. Martin argued with me for nearly an hour when I told him what I intended to do next. He sat across from me in his office with his tie loosened and said, "Walter, voiding the Larkspur sale is enough. The trust protects the land automatically. You don't have to do anything else. Let the fraud charges handle Nathan. Let the DA handle Derek. You don't need to buy their house. I'm not buying it for revenge." "Martin," I said, "though I will admit to you now, in the privacy of telling this story honestly, that revenge was certainly present in the room with us that day. I'm buying it because Eleanor asked me for exactly one thing before she died. She asked me to keep the family together on that hill. Nathan sold that promise for a townhome deal. I intend to keep it anyway, and I intend for my son to understand, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what that promise cost him." The closing on the house took 9 days. The 11th day, the day Havenbrook's $340,000 wire transfer was scheduled to finalize on Larkspur Hill, arrived with a cold, bright winter sun. That morning, Martin and I filed the emergency motion. It took the county court exactly 40 minutes to issue a temporary restraining order, voiding the Larkspur Hill sale entirely, on the basis of the irrevocable trust documents and the expired power of attorney. The land, the hillside, the oak trees, and Eleanor's grave were by early afternoon permanently safe, exactly as they had always legally been, whether Nathan understood that or not. At 2:40 that afternoon, Derek Holloway's account, the one waiting to receive Nathan's wire transfer, sent a $340,000 request that bounced back, instantly with a fraud review flag, since Havenbrook's underlying transaction had just been legally nullified by court order before the funds ever cleared. Derek would not be disappearing to any beach that week. He would instead be receiving a visit from Buncombe County detectives regarding an in-corporation fraud investigation that Martin had already quietly initiated the moment we confirmed the Shell company's ownership trail. At 3:15 that afternoon, I drove out to the rental house where Nathan and Chelsea had been living for the past 2 weeks, waiting for their fortune to arrive. I did not go alone. Martin drove, and in the passenger seat, I carried a single manila folder containing everything: the trust documents, the voided sale order, the security footage transcript, and a fresh deed showing Ridgeline Family Partners LLC as the new legal owner of the very driveway we were currently parking in. Nathan opened the door looking like a man who had aged 5 years in 11 days. Chelsea stood behind him in the hallway, arms crossed, her face already curdling into the particular fury of someone who senses, before she even understands why, that the ground has shifted beneath her. "Dad," Nathan said, and for one brief moment I saw the boy again, the one who used to run to the door when I came home from the courthouse. "What's going on?" The bank called. "They said the Larkspur sale got voided. There's some kind of court order." "There is," I said. "The land was never yours to sell, Nathan. Your mother and I put it into an irrevocable trust 8 years ago, specifically to protect it from exactly this kind of decision. You forged authority under a power of attorney that expired 18 months before you signed it. That is a federal and state matter now out of my hands." Chelsea stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You did this? You destroyed our deal? Do you have any idea what we lose because of your paranoid old man hoarding of a hillside full of dead people?" I looked at her for a long moment before I answered, and I let my voice stay perfectly level. The voice I had used for 3 decades to deliver verdicts to men who thought themselves untouchable. "I know precisely what you lose, Chelsea," I said. "You lose the $340,000. That was never going to reach either of you anyway, since Derek Holloway had already arranged to move it into a second account the moment it cleared, with plans to leave the country without either of you knowing when." I watched her face go white. Nathan turned to look at her, confusion sliding slowly into something far darker. "You also lose this house," I continued, and I opened the manila folder and laid the new deed on the small entry table beside the door, the one you sold 2 weeks ago to fund the life you thought you were escaping into. It now belongs to Ridgeline Family Partners LLC. I am the sole managing member. Nathan stared at the paper. Chelsea stared at me. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. "You bought our house," Nathan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did," I said, "and I intend to do something with the land your mother would have wanted." I did not tell them in that doorway exactly what that meant. So I let them sit with the wreckage of everything they had built for another 3 weeks, while the legal machinery finished its slow, grinding work. Derek Holloway was formally charged with wire fraud and incorporation fraud tied to the shell company scheme. Chelsea, once the recording surfaced in the discovery process of the fraud investigation, found herself facing conspiracy charges of her own, since a wife who knowingly assists in forging her father-in-law's expired authority to sell a family trust asset does not simply get to call herself an innocent bystander. Nathan facing his own forgery charges but cooperating fully once he understood the depth of Chelsea and Derek's betrayal, took a plea deal that spared him prison but left him with a felony record. A mountain of restitution and, perhaps most painfully of all, the public knowledge, spread through every relative and old family friend, of exactly what he had tried to sell and exactly who had tried to sell him out in return. But I want to back up, because the doorway conversation was not, in fact, the end of it. It was only the quiet opening move. I had one more piece of the board left to play, and I had been saving it, the way you save the strongest witness for the very last day of trial. Before any of the fraud charges were filed, before the restraining order on Larkspur Hill was even public record, Nathan and Chelsea had already sent out invitations for what they were calling their new beginnings, housewarming party, a lavish celebration at the very house I had just quietly purchased out from under them, intended to be thrown the same week the Larkspur money was supposed to clear. They had told nearly 200 people, half the country club, half of Chelsea's old sorority network, and most of my own extended family, that they had come into some fortunate news and wanted to celebrate. Chelsea, in the arrogance of a woman who believed she had already won, refused to cancel the party even after the restraining order hit, insisting to Nathan that it was simply a technicality, that Martin and I would eventually back down. From once we saw how serious they were, I did not stop that party. Martin thought I had lost my mind when I told him so. "Walter, you have the evidence. You have the voided sale. Let the DA's office handle Derek and Chelsea quietly through the courts. Why on earth would you let 200 people watch this unfold in person?" "Because my son told me his mother's grave was just business, Martin," I said. "He said it standing in his own kitchen, casual as ordering coffee. If greed is going to be conducted in public, in front of people whose good opinion he still values more than his own father's, then the consequence is going to arrive the same way, in public, in front of the same people. I want to be honest about something here, because I promised myself I would tell this story straight. There is a version of a man who would have quietly let the courts handle everything and gone back to his coffee, percolator and his Sunday visits, satisfied with private justice. I'm not entirely that man, and I will not pretend to you that I am. Eleanor deserved better than a quiet paperwork correction. She deserved to have her name spoken clearly, in front of witnesses, the same way her grave had nearly been dug, up in the daylight, for anyone driving past to see. The party was held on a Saturday evening, string lights strung across the very lawn where Eleanor's memorial garden would eventually stand, caterers moving through the crowd with trays of the kind of small, expensive appetizers that people serve when they want strangers to believe they have always lived this way. I arrived at 7:40, dressed in the dark grey suit I had worn to my retirement dinner from the bench, the one that still fit exactly the way it had a decade earlier, because some men let grief soften them, and some men let it sharpen them, and I had chosen, deliberately, which kind of man I intended to be that night. Nathan saw me first from across the lawn, and I watched the color drain out of his face the way it had in the doorway. 3 weeks earlier, except now there were 200 witnesses standing between us instead of none. Chelsea saw him freeze and followed his gaze, and her expression curdled instantly from hostess bright to something far colder. "You are not welcome here," she said. crossing the lawn quickly, her heels sinking slightly into the grass with every furious step. "This is our celebration, Walter. You've already caused enough damage. Leave before I have security walk you out." "I'm not here to cause a scene. Chelsea," I said, and I meant it, in the narrow legal sense that I never once raised my voice that entire evening. "I'm here to deliver something I believe your guests would want to see, given how much they've apparently already been told about your good fortune." I did not need a microphone, and I did not reach for one, because a man who has spent 3 decades commanding a courtroom does not need amplification to make 200 people go quiet. I simply raised my voice enough to carry across the lawn the same measured, unhurried tone I had used to read verdicts for 31 years, and I began to speak. 6 weeks ago, I said, my son forged an expired power of attorney to sell my late wife's grave, along with 3 generations of our family, to a shell company financed with borrowed money, in order to fund the very house you are all currently standing in front of. A ripple went through the crowd immediately. Conversations dying mid-sentence, glasses lowering. That sale has since been permanently voided by court order, because the land was never his to sell in the first place. It belonged and still belongs to an irrevocable family, trust my late wife, and I created together specifically to prevent exactly this kind of decision. "Get him off my lawn," Chelsea hissed at Nathan, who did not move, frozen somewhere between shame and shock. "This house you are celebrating tonight," I continued, "the one you sold 2 weeks ago, believing you would soon walk away wealthy, is also no longer yours. It belongs to a family holding company I formed the week I discovered what my son had done. You are at this moment hosting a party on my property." The murmurs turned into open gasps. Somewhere near the caterer's table, I saw Martin's contact from the DA's office, a young woman named Priya Anand, who had quietly accepted my invitation to attend as an observer, exchange a brief professional nod with me from across the lawn. "There is one more matter I think this crowd deserves to understand," I said, and here, for the only time that night, I allowed my voice to slow down, because I wanted every single word to land clearly. "The man who financed the shell, company that purchased my family's burial, Ground was never planning to share a single dollar of it with my son. He was planning to disappear with it entirely, along with my daughter-in-law, the moment the funds cleared. I have a recording, obtained legally through a security system in my own home, of the 2 of them discussing exactly that plan, in detail, 4 nights before this deal was set to close. Chelsea's face went the color of the tablecloths. Nathan turned to look at her with an expression I hope I never have to see on my son's face again as long as I live. The look of a man realizing, in front of 200 people, that the woman he had betrayed his own father for had never once intended to stay. "Derek isn't even here tonight, is he, Chelsea?" I asked, and I did not raise my voice at all for that question, because I did not need to. The silence around us did the work instead. She did not answer. She did not need to. Her silence in front of every friend and relative she had spent years cultivating, for exactly this kind of moment, was its own confession, louder than anything I could have said. I did not stay much longer after that. I did not need to watch the party dissolve. Guests quietly setting down their glasses and finding excuses to leave, phones already lighting up with messages spreading the story faster than any courtroom could have managed. I walked back to my car, and Martin, who had been waiting quietly by the curb the entire time, simply looked at me and said, "You didn't raise your voice once." "I never needed to," I said. The truth was loud enough on its own. 3 weeks after that party, I stood on the front lawn of the house my son and daughter-in-law used to call home, now legally and entirely mine, with a small crew of stonemasons and a landscape architect I had hired from Charlotte, a man who specialized in private memorial gardens. We did not disinter anyone. Eleanor remains exactly where she always belonged, on the hillside under the oak trees, safe now behind a trust that no one will ever be able to touch again as long as the law of this state means anything at all. But on the lawn of that house, the house Nathan and Chelsea sold to fund an escape that never came, I built something else. A modest, dignified stone memorial garden, with a granite bench, a small reflecting pool, and a single carved marker bearing Eleanor's name and the words she asked me for in that hospice bed, keep us together. It is not a grave, it is a promise poured into stone, standing in the exact spot where my son once believed his greed had bought him. A new life. 6 months have passed since that grey November morning. I found a chain-link fence around my wife's resting place. Nathan finished his community service and his restitution payments last month, working a construction job that, in an irony I try not to enjoy too openly, involves quite a lot of concrete pouring. He does not live in that house anymore, obviously. Chelsea does not live anywhere near Asheville anymore, her name quietly attached to an ongoing fraud case that her old country club friends stopped mentioning within a week of the story breaking. Derek Holloway, last I heard through Martin's contacts, is somewhere in Florida, still waiting to hear whether the federal charges will follow him there. Nathan came to see me 2 months ago unannounced, standing on my porch with his hands in his pockets, like a boy waiting to be scolded. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for forgiveness, not exactly. He asked if he could visit his mother's grave. I said yes. I drove him out there myself, and I stood a respectful distance, back under the oak trees, while he knelt at her headstone for a very long time, saying things I did not need to hear, because they were never meant for me. I still make my coffee in the old percolator every morning. I still drive out to Larkspur Hill every Sunday, past the oak trees that are exactly where they have always been, exactly where Eleanor asked me to keep them. And some Sundays now, if the weather is good, I drive a little farther down the road, to the small stone garden on a lawn that used to belong to my son, and I sit on that granite bench, and I tell my wife that I kept my promise. They thought an old man's silence meant surrender. They forgot that a judge who has gone quiet is not a judge who has given up. He is simply reading the file one more time before he writes the verdict. I think often about the exact moment everything turned, and I have come to believe it was never the fence or the notice, or even the phone call where my son told me his mother's grave was just business. It was the choice I made in my kitchen that first night, sitting alone with a cold cup of coffee, to feel the full weight of what had happened before I let myself act on it. Grief and fury are not the same thing, though they wear similar faces in the mirror, and I have watched enough broken men stand before my bench over the decades to know that the ones who act from fury alone are always the ones who make careless mistakes. I did not want to make a careless mistake with the last promise I would ever keep to my wife, so I waited. I documented. I let 11 days pass instead of one furious hour, and in those 11 days, the truth built itself into something far sturdier than anger ever could have. My granddaughter, Nathan's daughter from an earlier, brief marriage before Chelsea, calls me every Sunday evening now, after I get back from the hill. She is 14, sharp as a tack, and she asked me once, in the blunt way only a teenager can manage, whether I felt guilty about what happened to her father. I told her the truth, because I have never believed in lying to children about consequences. I told her I felt sorrow deep and constant, the particular sorrow of watching someone you raised choose the wrong door when you know, better than anyone alive, exactly what waits on the other side of it. But I told her I did not feel guilt, because guilt belongs to the person who makes the choice, not the person who simply refuses to shield him from what that choice costs. Nathan is rebuilding slowly. He works construction now, 6 days a week, and last month, for the first time since all of this began, he brought flowers out to Larkspur Hill on his own, without me driving him there, and left them at his mother's headstone with a small card that simply read, "I'm trying to be someone you'd recognize again." I keep that card in my study, beside the photograph of Eleanor on our wedding day, not because I have forgiven everything, but because I believe a man deserves to be measured by what he does after he is caught, not only by what he did before. Chelsea, I am told, eventually accepted a plea deal of her own on the conspiracy charges, and moved out of state, entirely once the restitution, payments and the public shame of that Saturday evening became more than her carefully built reputation could survive. I do not know where she is now, and I have made my peace with not knowing. Some people you simply have to let become a closed file. I still drive out to Larkspur Hill every single Sunday, rain or shine, the same route I have driven for years, past the same bend in the road where the oak trees first come into view. The chain-link fence is long gone. replaced now with a restored iron gate that Martin helped me commission, engraved with a single line at Eleanor's request from years ago, back when we first drew up the trust together. This ground is not for sale. I sit on the bench beside her headstone, and I tell her about the week. The way I always have, and some Sundays, if the light is good and my knees are cooperating, I drive the extra. 10 minutes down the road afterward to sit in the small stone garden on the lawn that used to belong to my son, and I remind her out loud in the quiet that I kept my promise. Family is not a blood type. It is a decision you make every single day, and it is a decision you can unmake too. If you decide someone else's memory is worth less than your own convenience. My son learned that lesson at 36 years old, standing in a doorway, watching his father lay a deed down on a table.